How to grow onions, leeks, and shallots in Kentucky gardens. Onions are a member of the allium family, which is a pretty large family of plants. Bulb onions can be sold as green or immature plants, actually little plants, or as little mature bulbs that we can actually plant, or as a full grown bulb that we would then just eat. Bunching onions are sold as green onions pretty much solely. And onions are a biennial bulb. The first year, generally speaking, they are growing vegetatively, and then the second year they will bolt and flower. Sometimes you'll get bolting in the first year, especially depending on the type of onions you grow and whatever the weather patterns may be. Onions can come in a lot of different shapes. This chart here is just showing you the onion shapes, or the bulb shapes. First off is number one up there, that's a flattened or globe type. Number two is the globe, which is basically just a round onion. Three is a high globe, and you can see it's more of an elongated or oval shape. Four is a spindle. Five is a Spanish, or what we buy Spanish onions at the grocery store. That's the kind of the typical shape that we think of in most onions. Number six is flat. Some of the Vidalia types are a little flatter, not quite that flat as the number six there. That's more of a Cipollina onion. Number seven is the thick flat, and number eight is the Granix, which is actually the type that the Vidalia and some of the other sweet onions that we think of are that shape. But we're going to talk about some other varieties here in a little bit, and you'll get more of that round shape in a really highly sweet onion. And number nine is just called a top onion. You can see it's just got a high shoulder. First of all, why do you want to grow your onions? Well, they're difficult to avoid them. They're in a lot of different um, dishes. They do make most dishes taste better. Some people may not like onions, but the vast majority of people do like the flavor of onions in dishes. And the average American eats about 18 pounds of onions each year. You may not eat one raw, but they're going to be cooked in a lot of different dishes, and they're going to be in there. It's hard to avoid them. They do store very well, which is a great option for a lot of onions. Some of our extra sweet onions don't store that well. We'll talk about that just a little bit later. And another one is, especially if you let them grow to maturity, it's a once over harvest, so you can go in there, harvest your onions, store them, and then plant another crop right back in that space. First off, we're going to talk about bulb onions. Onions do bulb in response to day length. That's some of the biggest issue that people that have tried to grow larger onions here in Kentucky have had, is just by not planting the right types. We have long day onions, which take about a 14-hour day length, or they'll bolt. That's more of a northern onion. And then we have the intermediate day, which is about a 12-hour day length onion. And then we have the short day, which is a 10 to 11-hour day length for bulbing, and that's going to be more of a southern onion. Here in Kentucky, we usually will plant the intermediate day, which is more of a neutral type. That's what we generally grow here. We can also get by some years, or most years, by planting a long day and still get a reasonably good harvest on it. It just might get a few of those that will bolt on you, and you'll just pull those up and toss those, or maybe just eat the green portions of them then. Here's the day length and bulbing chart in Kentucky, and you can see the short day lengths there is at 10 hours. So you can see by the time we get over to March and even April, we're already into that intermediate day, or getting really close to it. So we'll recommend planting by late March, so these plants will grow, and you can see the day lengths for those to bulb are then above the intermediate day all the way through until we get to through September. So usually we'll harvest our onions sometime in early July, and we're at that long length. Now, you can see that where we can grow the long day length, but they won't start bulbing until we get up into the June. So you may not get quite as large an onion as you would with the intermediate day, because they can start bulbing at a much younger age. Here's a short day onion in the fall, and you can see these tiny little onions. They went ahead and bulbed, thinking that they were in their season already, and so you'll never get a large onion out of these. Here we'll talk about onion seeding and transplants. If you want to try to grow your own, transplant production is preferred. Onions do not compete well with weeds, so you're going to have a completely weed-free bed. You can seed into transplant beds at high density, which is about 20 plants a foot, and then you're going to grow them at 8 to 10 weeks, and then you're going to pull those out and then replant those into the garden. You could also seed into 200 cell trays and then grow for 8 weeks and then plant into the garden. By these pictures here, you could also just buy your plants, which is what most of us are going to do there on the left, and the plants will be shipped directly to you, and then you can just plant those directly in your garden. On the right there is what they would look like in a seed bed, and they'll just pull those out, trim the tops off, and then mail those out to you. Here's a grower that would be a commercial grower. They're growing their own transplants because they're cheaper to grow if you need thousands and thousands of them this way. But you can see there they've seeded those directly into some seed trays, and then they'll transplant those up and bump those up and end up planting those directly into the field. Other ways we can get onions is transplants and sets. Transplants are not sets. They're little seedlings, which is what we just showed you in the couple slides ago in a box where they just send you the little actually plants growing. And we can also get sets or bulblets, which most of us around here are familiar with them. They're the little bulbs you can buy at the farm stores this time of year. And usually you will plant those and grow those on and eat those as green onions in the summer. Large sets bring many small bulbs in the summer. Those would be your potato onions we'll talk about a little later, which are also shallots. Planting time in Kentucky or this part of Kentucky is usually between March the 1st and April the 14th. I like to put them in anywhere from mid-March until the 1st of April, if even up to April 14th, but usually around April 1st at least, I want them in the garden. Bulbing onions do like loose, sandy, loamy soil. Hard clay will reduce your bulbing size because they are pushing against that hard clay, and it's a lot easier for them to expand and get larger if it's in a looser soil. So if you can, go ahead and add organic matter, compost, something like that into your planting area so you can make sure you have a nice loose soil for those bulbs to develop into nice large onions. If you're going to plant the little spring bulbs, which we're going to grow for green onions, which is you can see the little bulbs right now at the garden centers, you can plant those anytime from spring into late summer. It just depends on whenever you want your green onions. They'll grow pretty well most of the season. Because again, we're not worrying about those growing a large bulb. All we're going to get out of those, generally speaking, is just a green onion to eat with our meals. Here are some planting times depending on what you want to do and how you want to grow your onions. If you're going to grow them by seed, you need to spring seed them in late January, which we're past that window. Also, then you would transplant those in late March into the garden, which is what we're going to be doing now with the plants that you're all going to be receiving from the class. And then the latest date for transplants is July 1st. You would be growing those transplants that would then turn into a bulb in the fall, and then you would dig those and plant those back and eat them as green onions the following year. You do want to trim your onions prior to transplant, just to give some shoot to root ratio there, so you want to trim those back. And the next question is, for homeowners, is seeding a good idea? For most of us, it is not. Uh, it is time consuming. You've got to make sure that you keep your lighting right, because if you don't, you're going to end up with a young plant going to bulb and not growing into a large onion, which you would want it to. So these are just the time frames if anybody wanted to try that. But for most of us, we're just going to go ahead and buy the transplants or the little bulbing onions and plant those at the proper time. These are the trim onions I talked about. These are, if you're growing your own transplants, you can just trim the tops back before you transplant, just to make sure you've got a little less leaf ratio. That way you can make sure that the roots will be expanding enough that they can actually take care of whatever the water needs are for the tops. When planting your onion plants, you do want to plant them in raised beds if at all possible. I usually just plant them in rows in the garden. It's totally up to you. You can get more onions in a smaller space by planting in a raised bed. It just makes it a little more difficult to keep the weeds out. If you do put them in raised beds, you want them about 8 to 12 inches between rows and 6 to 8 inches between the plants, as you can see there in the picture. Do you want to use plastic? I don't use plastic. I think it's more work than what's needed to. Large production facilities may use plastic just because it keeps the weeds down. You can use it. The onions can bulb under the plastic, but just keep in mind the heat and the humidity under there is going to increase some of your bacterial diseases. So we've got our plastic down. So then we're coming back to some of the fertilizing, which by putting plastic down is going to make fertilizing harder. So I would rather not put plastic down. You can put out about 2 pounds of ammonium nitrate pre-plant. That's per 1,000 square feet. And then think about that's based on what you've already done a soil test and you know how much phosphorus and potassium you may need. So you're going to need a little more ammonium nitrate than that. If you can't get ammonium nitrate, you can use urea. You're going to side dress 1 to 2 weeks after the bulb formation starts, and then that's about 10 tablespoons of ammonium nitrate per 10 feet of row. Again, if you can't find ammonium nitrate, you can substitute urea. The nitrogen fertility needs to stop about 8 weeks prior to harvest because what will happen is too much nitrogen, the bulbs won't keep as long. So the goal here is with the nitrogen is to get the maximum number of leaves on an onion plant as you can get, because each leaf is above ground that you see is a ring around that bulb at the bottom. So the more leaves you've got up, the bigger the onion you're going to end up growing. After planting, especially on the plant types of onions, you're going to make sure you need to keep them watered because their root systems are even dried up or not a lot there. And you do want to get them started off to a good start, so make sure that they have plenty of water. Just don't keep them too wet because they can rot. Another big thing is the onion maggot. Some years they're really bad, some years they're not. Last year they were horrible, not just in onions, but they would lay eggs into the right at the soil surface into broccoli, cabbage, and cauliflower stems, and then they would burrow in and eat the stem, and the plant would die. With onions, they can be really bad, and you'll end up with not a very good stand if it's the year that they're bad. Usually, a cool, wet spring is going to be a problem, and for us, most of the time, that is what type of spring we have. So, to make sure you don't have that problem, go ahead as soon as you plant. Go ahead and spray a spray of malathion right at the base of each little plant with your sprayer and let it kind of soak into the soil there a little bit around each plant. And they'll at least give you some barrier there if that seed corn maggot or onion maggot, they're the same thing. If that fly comes and lays its eggs there, those eggs will die once they're hatched. As far as irrigating onions, generally speaking, I've not had to irrigate them much over the years to get larger onions because we usually have plenty of water in the spring here or rain in the spring, and we usually don't start getting dry until these are time for harvest, which is usually around the 1st of July. But some years we have had dry Mays and dry Junes, and if that's the case, you will need to water. Onions don't require a lot of water if you're not worried about getting large bulbs. But if you want large bulbs, you're going to need to make sure that you provide enough water for that to happen. As I said earlier, each scale in the bulb is actually a leaf, and it swells with water as it grows, and that's where we end up making the bulb there. So the more leaves, the more scales we get in that bulb, the larger bulb we have. You can grow onions fine without a lot of water, but you get a small, pungent, not sweet bulb, and that's not what we want to do here. So just make sure if we have a dry spell, especially in May and June, that you're going to need to water these because that's the critical time there whenever that's really sizing up. Some fertility management here. Fertility significantly affects the flavor of onions. Sulfur is the primary factor affecting onion pungency. So if you don't like hot onions, if you have a high sulfur content in your soil, you're going to have a hotter onion. High sulfur is not a lot we can do. Most of us don't have a really high sulfur content around here in our soils, but it does happen and depends on the year and how much rain and things we've had too. Also, too much nitrogen give you an off flavor or cabbage-like flavor. It also can lead to excessive foliar growth, which will decrease your bulb yields. That's why we want to stop the nitrogen addition 8 weeks before harvest, which I talked about earlier. High nitrogen also will cause decreased storage life, so they just rot easier. And an ammonium nitrate, or urea, again, both that's your nitrogen sources, either one of those. If you can't get ammonium nitrate, you can use urea. They're going to do the same thing. So any of those nitrogen sources are going to cause some problems, especially if they're applied too late into the season. Here's a commercial field of onions. You can see there that some of them have gone to flower. That's called bolting. That's not a good thing growing onions because they have a hard stalk in it and there's not a bulb there. Remember, these are biennial. So as being a biennial, they're going to be vegetative for a season and then they're going to bolt and grow a flower. These thought they've had their biennialness met, and probably they had a cool spell or the day length wasn't right, and some of them just went ahead and bolted. So you'll pull those out, throw those away. You may get a little bit off of those for a homeowner. If you want a little bit of onion from one of them, you can get a little bit, but you won't get a bulb off of those. Another thing here is just remember low nitrogen 8 weeks from harvest and low sulfur equals sweet onions. So picking the right variety, and if you meet those two, the right variety, and then the low nitrogen and the low sulfur 8 weeks, you're going to get a sweet onion. Here are some undesirables. They're not necessarily undesirables for us as homeowners, but if for commercial production they are. As I mentioned earlier, bolting is the flower emergence. That is undesirable because that causes a hollow center. Again, that's due to low temperatures for a long time, then warming. It just made that plant, that particular plant, that thought that it had had its requirement and went ahead and bolted to flower to make seeds instead of a bulb. This is also very variety dependent. Some varieties are more prone to it than others. Generally speaking, you're going to get a few of these no matter which variety you grow. So don't worry if you get a few of them. You'll just pull them up, whatever you can eat off of them, eat, and toss the rest of it. Doubling here depends strongly on variety as well. That's not a big issue for us as homeowners because we'll just pull those up and we'll eat them separately. But if you're selling onions, that's an undesirable, and they'll have to cull those. Here's bolting again, and you can see this whole field bolted. So a couple things, they had the wrong variety for the location, and we had probably a cold spell, maybe a colder spell than what was normal late in the season for a longer period, and it just caused them to bolt. So this whole crop here is pretty much lost. But again, if you grow the right varieties, you'll get some of this, but you won't get an entire loss of your crop. You may get 3 or 4% of them to bolt, not the entire crop. Here we have pest management for onions, and remember the pest management is going to be for onions. It's also going to suffice for the leeks and going to suffice for the shallots. So there's two primary insect pests. We have the onion maggot and the onion thrip, or just thrips. But you can see on the left there, that's the thrip damage. It almost, when you first see it, looks a little like spider mite damage, but it's not. It's thrips actually scraping off that green off the top of the leaf. So it reduces your photosynthesis, which we can reduce your harvest. The onion maggot, remember, is an early season pest. Earlier in the video that you can see, it's a little maggot that actually eats and burrows into the little onion and causes it to rot and die. For thrips, you want to sample under the leaf folds, and you can see usually by the time you start to notice a lot of it there, it's pretty bad. But if you see a few of those tiny little thrips in the leaf fold where the leaf meets the stalk, go ahead and spray. 10 to 25 thrips per plant is enough to cause some damage. So go ahead and spray with malathion or another chemical that is labeled for onions. Generally, malathion is cheap, it's easy to get, and it's an older insecticide. Most of us have it readily available. If you don't want to use malathion, you can use neem oil. It won't be as effective, but it'll be helpful. And if you wanted to try some beneficial insects, you can do that. But for the most part, thrips are small, and some of our beneficials don't do a really good job at controlling those. Here's a disease called botrytis neck rot. It is the most significant problem, particularly in storing onions. It's because it causes them to rot from the top down. The botrytis can enter the top of the onion through infected seed, decaying leaves, neck wounds. So this is one of the problems if you leave your onions in the garden too long and let them dry too far before harvest them. You can get some of this botrytis to set in at the top of that bulb, and it will just reduce your storage on a lot of these, and they'll rot. Um, the main thing here is to make sure that you get them out of the garden, get them dried down quickly so you can avoid that getting in there. There are some sprays that you could try, but for homeowners, it's not really feasible for us. So the best thing to do is harvest them at the right time, get them out of the weather, and get them dried to avoid some of these fungal pathogens getting into that neck before you get them into a good area. So as mentioned, harvest is very important in avoiding the neck rot and some other problems with storage. You do want to cut water off 10 days prior to harvest on these onions. Now I know that's not necessarily feasible for us because we have regular rains here in Kentucky. But don't water. If we have a dry spell, go ahead and let them be dry for those 10 days. You want to harvest when 75% of the plants go tops down, which all that means is instead of the top standing up, the top will just lay over. When 3/4 of them have laid over, it's time to pull everything up. You want to undercut the bulbs to allow to dry for a few days, which basically is just pull those up. Some people do let them store or dry in the garden. I do not like that because a couple of reasons there. It can rain on those. It's going to which will get them wet. And we don't want that. There's going to be dew every night, which is going to get them wet, and we don't want that. There's also going to be an increased chance of them getting sunburned, which they will rot. We don't want that. So, what's the key? You need to get these out of the weather. So, if you've got an area where you can lay them out in a single run in a barn or a garage, a carport, something like that, just to get them out of that weather, they're going to dry down easier that way. Maybe not as quick because they're not going to be in the sun, but they're going to dry down quick enough and they're going to be out of the weather to reduce the amount of rot that might set in. Once they dry down, then you can cut the tops off and just store them as you would any other onion. As I said, once they dry down, you can go ahead and cut those tops back. Do leave an inch or two of neck on the bulb, which is just the spot, the dried tops. That will seal the bulb. It's kind of like leaving the stem on a pumpkin. It helps seal it instead of taking it off directly at the fruit. Then you want to let them cure, ideally 48 to 72 hours at 96 degrees Fahrenheit. Now for us, I know that's not possible. So again, don't cure them in the field. We have too much water here, too much chances of rain and rot. So you can see the top, they just laid them out there under a carport or a porch. And then if you've got a barn or garage, that's great too. Just get them out of the weather. Down south, they can will let them cure in the field and then cut the tops off and actually bag them in the fields, which is great. Our weather is just not conducive for that here. Further storage, once they've cured down, you want to get them as cold as you can get them. It doesn't mean that you have to. They will keep longer though, so that's going to be 34 degrees. 40 would be great too. Anything that you can put them and keep them cool, refrigerator is going to be best. If you had a refrigerator dedicated to produce and for other storage methods, that'd be great. I generally just store them at room temperature and they last for several months, even being really sweet onions. Again, mild onions store poorly, so keep in mind these onions are not going to be the Spanish onions that you buy at the store that are kind of hot. These are going to be sweet onions. These are just not going to keep that long. So have a plan on where to store them and a plan of what to use them or how to use them to make sure that you don't lose them. You can always cut them up. You can freeze them. Those are some different methods out there for taking care of those or even drying them. Again, don't harvest too soon either because immature onions will not store properly either. Keep them dry. Don't wash them before storing them. There's no reason to do that. Just kind of rub the dirt off, put them in your storage bins, and let them stay that way. The key to getting onions to last a while is to make sure once they're harvested, they don't come in contact with water. Here are some suggested varieties of sweet onions or spring planted onions here in Kentucky. We got Expression, Candy, Sweet Spanish, Red Candy Apple, Superstar, Walla Walla, Red Line, Peso. There are more out there, but these are the top ones. By this list here, the very top ones for our area here in Central Kentucky is Candy, Red Candy Apple, and Superstar. Doesn't mean there's not other ones out there we can grow, because there are, but these are just the ones that are more suited to our location. Here's some pictures of those. We have Expression there on the left. We have Candy, which is one of the better, sweeter onions there in the middle. It's a yellow onion. Then we have Superstar, which is a white onion, which usually gets pretty large here in our part of Kentucky if you plant them properly and take care of them. We have Red Line on the right there is a nice red onion. And then we have Sweet Spanish and Peso, which I've not grown those that much here and had very good luck with those, but they are suited to our climate. And then we have red candy apple there at the bottom, and some years you will get very large red onions out of that one too. Matter of fact, the picture at the front of this PowerPoint, I believe, is red candy apple and candy. So you can see how big they get. So now we're going to go on to the shallot portion, or potato onions. Growing up, we call these potato onions. I had no idea that they were shallots, which is considered a really more of a delicate onion flavor, and you can see these in a lot of French cuisine. They are easy to grow, perennial onions, which is great if you want to make you a perennial bed with onions in it. You can do that. They'll produce small clusters of bulbs that you can then eat. So instead of one large bulb, you may plant one clove, and you may end up with 4 or 5 small bulbs after that, after one season. So you can plant these spring or fall. Generally, we plant the bulbs in the spring or the fall, but usually the fall, and then we'll plant the plants in the spring. You can dig in the fall, or you can let them overwinter indoors as just a dried bulb, or you can leave in place in the ground, or you can even dig these after the tops dry back and then replant in the fall. And if you wanted to move them, or you wanted them more evenly spaced out in your bed, these are very easy to grow. These are pretty much foolproof plants here. They do have the same requirements as onions as far as water and fertilize and all that. So that makes that easy. It makes these easy to grow next door to your larger bulbing onions that you're growing. Leeks are another one that's grown very similar to our onions. They are grown for their large stalks instead of the bulbs. They just grow a large, thick stalk. Also has a very mild onion flavor. They grow about 6 to 10 inches long, and that white stem is what we're looking for in that picture. We would cut this and eat up until whenever the leaves started. So it's that stalk that we're wanting to eat. They do have a mild flavor, a milder flavor than onions or even garlic. So they're really nice, subtle flavor. A lot of people who grow these use them in soups and stews, and sometimes you see them in rice stir fries and things. You want to plant as you would your onion plants earlier in the video with the same fertilization and cultural requirements. So again, easy to grow in the same space with your other onions. So to get the best leeks, they must be blanched in the soil, and by blanched is trying to get more of that long white stem. So that's what we're looking for. This is simply means that you're going to pull soil up around the plant to increase the amount of white stem. Basically, it's in the dark, so it loses its chlorophyll and it turns white. Same thing people do with some of the white asparagus. So that just increases the amount of edible portion for you. When the stem is the width of a pencil, that's when you want to start pulling your soil up around the plant up into the lower leaves. And then don't blanch too early, because you do want to get some length on that stem before you start covering and blanching. So once it becomes about a pencil, you can start pulling soil up around that. And if you get 5 or 6, 7 or 8 inches, that'd be great before you started covering that. They're ready for harvest when an inch or more in diameter. So once that stalk gets about an inch or more in diameter, you can start harvesting these and you can start eating them. So what are you getting? You're going to get an intermediate day sampler, which is the sweet large onions we talked about. Uh, you're going to get a bundle of 50 to 75 plants. They're going to be mixed. They're easy to tell apart, though, because the red one is the red candy apple. The superstar is the white one, and candy is the yellow one. So there, if you wanted to separate that out in your garden, you could still do that with this bunch of onions. Now with the Leeks, you're going to get 25 to 30 plants, which is a half a bundle. And then you're going to get a half a bundle of Dutch shallots, which are about 25 to 30 plants. Now the shallots, most of us are familiar with growing those by planting bulbs, but you're actually going to get the little plants, just like with your onions and your leeks this time. And by July, that plant is going to have grown and produced, instead of uh, a large onion, it's going to produce a small shallot. If you want to order more plants on your own, all these plants did come from Dixondale Farms, and there's a link there at the bottom. If you'd like to do that, they're very easy to work with and been a very reputable company. I've ordered my onion plants for them for years. So that's all of our onion class, or onions, leeks, and shallot class. Again, I should have said those that registered for the class will get the plants. They can be picked up here at the extension office anytime. I say anytime, they should be picked up within the next week because, again, they are live plants. If anyone has any questions on growing onions, leeks, or shallots, you can call me at the Washington County Extension Office at 859-336-7741. Happy gardening!